Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, October 2nd edition of the Cluster API Office Hours, a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Just a reminder that this meeting does adhere to the Kubernetes Community Code of Conduct. So in general, please be great to each other. And if you do want to comment, because this meeting does get pretty large, please do use the raised hand feature in Zoom to avoid people talking over each other. All right. First item on our, if you are attending live, please go ahead and add yourself to the attending list in the meeting notes. And if you have any topics that you want to bring up, please go ahead and add them to the agenda. To start off today, we have a couple of PSAs. Go ahead, Vince.
All right, so the first one is promoting some documentation reviewers. Motion that you're like kind of volunteered and signed up to be our like holdout for the book, and so I added like an owner file in doc/book with their name in it. So thank you so much for stepping up. And if you also would like to contribute in this area, please reach out. We'll be able to make another promotion process at some point or as part of this cycle as well. The other item that I had is that last week we presented like a proposal from Chuck to start like bringing in the KubeADM and the Docker provider, mostly for testing and to allow like better testing the end-to-end, and also like solve like some of the UX issues that we have today. The issue is linked in the meeting notes, and I would like to start to spec out work items in the next couple of days to make sure that this happens during the next cycle. And if there are no pushbacks or if there is any feedback, please feel free to comment on the issue. This should be pretty straightforward.
Chuck?
Yeah, I've just been playing around with submodules. If anybody has concerns with submodules, I can like point you to some tests that I've been doing that show what this might look like after the merge. I'll actually just link that in the notes.
All right. Any other questions or comments there before we move on to the demos? Yep. All right. Next up, we have a demo of the Kubernetes conformance with CapG. Dims?
Hi, Vince. Can you please share your screen?
Sure. So, 1 second. You all see this meeting notes. Do you want to present or I can?
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, so you'd shout out to them like to have like push like the CapG work to kind of have Kubernetes conformance tests. We have a test grid dashboard here, and as you can see, like we have all the conformance tests running for in CapG, so in the GCP provider for Cluster API. As far as I know, this is the first time that a provider in Cluster API is we have conformance for it. And for example, one thing that we found out yesterday is like that some of the conformance broke, and you can click on any of these to kind of like dig into it, for example, and in here you can see that there's like a lot of logs. You can see like that we have our instances running. So we have three control plane and 2 worker nodes all running in GCP. But the machine side of things, 2 of the control plane were stuck in provisioning phase. And this kind of came because we were using KubeADM from master, and it kind of like it gave us signal that like something was broken on the KubeADM side, which I believe Chuck is also fixing today, or there's a PR out already. So we're working on it. But this was an example like how it's great to have end-to-end tests that kind of test the whole system, and the signal here has been already proven useful. If you want to know more about the GCP provider, like we have under the cluster API provider GCP, we have a few folders here. One is under hack and one is under scripts. The one is, I don't know what happened there. The one in scripts is called CI E2E tests, which pretty much just sets up the environment and kind of like run the end-to-end conformance tests, which are under hack. And this goes and like sets up the GCP project, like builds images and does all the prerequisites that a user would do. So it like really tests the whole workflow of like building images, creating a cluster, making sure the cluster is up, and kind of like also running the conformance tests. Anything else you would like to add, Dims, to this?
Right. The one thing that I wanted to ask here for people to think about is we have a lot of things that are variables, right? What is the version of kind? What's the version of cluster API? Bootstrap provider for KubeADM, GCP, image builder, the KubeADM itself, then the Kubernetes that is installed, and then the version of the end-to-end test. So what are the combinations of things that we should set up CI for? Should we use master of everything, or that would be definitely one thing, but then that's more likely to fail. But if you don't have it, then it won't catch the things like what Vince was showing before. So we have the tools, we have the scripts, we just have to parameterize it for however we want to set this up. This is just the start. There is a pre-submit job as well as the CI job. So pre-submit is currently optional, as in it runs, but it is not a required job. So that's the way we have set it up right now. And this is only for CapG at this point, because we use gcloud in the scripts everywhere to set things up. That's all I had. So feel free to ask questions, and hopefully other people will find value in this too.
Tim?
So Travis and I even talked this morning on a similarly related note to simplify the image building process to be just a single script that is callable, or potentially just make your life, everyone who wants to make an image, make their life easier. So in looking through those scripts, there's, like you mentioned, there's several steps that can be automated by the individual componentry to make the overall script be smaller and a little more concise. So we should probably I don't know exactly where we're going to log these issues. The image builder one is very concrete. We'll log it there, deal with it. But with some of the other ones, we'll have to figure out where we want to track this stuff.
Chuck?
Yeah, I had a question on the conformance tests. I'm curious, are those like fleshed out? Are they defined like in some particular way? I guess I'm curious how conformance is being used here, and I apologize if I'm breaking up.
It's the regular conformance test that we use everywhere. No difference. We do the Ginkgo E2E, and we pass the same parameters that we passed. The only difference is in the KubeUp scripts, the KubeUp starts the cluster. So here we start the cluster and then run Ginkgo E2E.
So this is testing conformance on a target cluster?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, cool, awesome, thank you.
Any other questions on the demo?
Juan Lee, yes, those are the same tests that are run by Sonoboy.
All right, and back to Tim.
Just for clarity of intent, that the purpose of doing this is multi-pronged. Just so it's clear to everybody, one intent is to finally rid the world of the KubeUp scriptory. in the fullness of time because it's not maintained or owned by anybody. The second one is to get lead CI signal for Cluster API and its potential componentry for every release.
Right. So on the /cluster part, we have to do some research on how we integrate this with kubetest or something like that. That would be the thing there to do. But then if other providers have an interest in porting this to their own Capstar, that would be a interesting thing to think about as well.
Interested.
I'm just going to say you might want to hold on that until we reduce the number of scriptory variables, everything else that's required, because we can probably simplify your life for consumption.
Absolutely. And just for example, the Packer thing cannot run as root, and there's a bunch of code in there to create a fake user and then use that user to run Packer. So if we are able to move that kind of logic into the image builder itself with a make target, that would make this script really smaller.
And it looks like Alejandro in chat has a question about kubetest potentially being deprecated as well. Do you know more about that, Dims? Or
the Ginkgo E2E does use kubetest. The Ginkgo E2E, I think, is the one that we are trying to deprecate. There is a kubetest 2 that's got started, but that is not going anywhere. So at this point, bottom line is kubetest is still the one to use everywhere. I'll get that confirmed, Alejandro.
Any other
Confirmed.
questions? Okay. In that case, let's go ahead and push on. Vince, proposals check-in.
Before doing that, you just shout out to Dims for having pushed this so far, and the great signal that we're getting back. So for proposal check-in, I wanted to kind of get all the stakeholders together here to kind of just if we have an idea on a timeline on when do we want the proposals to be ready, so that we can kind of start seeing what's going to be in this cycle and what's going to be pushed out. And also maybe make sure that we have action items, reviewers lined up for the proposals, and all other things that are kind of needed. So I was gonna go in order here for machine pool. Do we have any target date when the PR or when you want reviewers for this proposal?
So we're planning to meet this week to do a kind of internal review of the machine pool stuff. I'll probably schedule that for tomorrow. And then probably 2 weeks from then, if that sounds right, Wanli?
Yeah, I think so. And if things go well in the review, then perhaps next week. But yeah, I think let's conservatively say the week after next.
And this is the Google Doc review, is that correct?
That's right.
And I guess another 1 or 2 weeks for PR?
That sounds about right. Assuming everything goes well.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're kind of looking at the end of the month for a possible PR for this one. Cluster upgrade, Amy.
Yeah, hey, sorry, I added the update lower in the doc, but I'll say it here. So that for cluster upgrade, we had a kickoff meeting yesterday morning, and the goal is we'll solidify the goals, on-goals, and motivations by Friday of this week, so that folks can review them on Monday and agree with that, and in parallel, we'll be working on the actual implementation details but those won't be ready to review Wednesday. So probably tack on another like week or two after Wednesday of next week is the goal for that.
So same as above, I guess, and same for the PR, I guess.
Yep.
Okay. For tests.
Yeah, so last time we spoke, this hadn't really been fleshed out, but Liz and I have been doing some talking and thinking and writing, and we have a lot of stuff in the link there, the Google Docs link that I think is ready for reviews. I'd love to have some folks volunteer to get written up as reviewers in the kept metadata. And then we can open the PR after there's general consensus on the design.
Okay, so this is ready for review from folks on the Google Doc.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess
Yep.
1-2 weeks from now, like we might have a PR out.
Depending, yeah. And it would be great if anybody wants to like be one of the official reviewers. I don't really know what that entails, but there's a section for it and I have to fill it out.
Yeah, it's usually definitely the maintainer section in Cluster API, but if anyone else wants to sign up, like they can just add their own GitHub handle there.
Okay, cool.
Control plane management, I think this is you.
Yes, so we've started doing some iteration on the design doc. It's not quite ready for wider review yet, hoping to get it in a good place where we can solicit further feedback by the end of the week. And then hopefully 1 to 2 weeks, we'll be able to solidify it enough to get the PR in place.
Okay, so it seems like we're looking at all the PRs to be kind of at the end of the month to be out, and which leaves us with like a few months of iteration on the possible kind of action items on those. And yeah, okay, sounds good. I just wanted to make sure that like we're all aligned on the same page around this. Any comments, questions, concerns? Tim?
Just a question, actually. Are other people like Michael or Renal planning to do the node remediation work this cycle?
Good question.
Is Michael still on the call?
I see Michael on the call, but
Can you hear me?
Yep.
yes.
Hello.
Yep.
Okay. I'm on the phone, but I think I got to unmute from the PC, which is weird. So yes, we're planning on getting some design proposal together. Downstream, we got some stuff going on in that area, and it should be very, very soon that you'll see an actual design proposal from us.
In terms of timeline, are you looking for reviewers today, or is it early?
I don't think we're on any definite timeline at the moment. I don't think we need any particular reviewers at the moment. Kind of when this thing comes, we're cool with wherever it ends up landing. And if somebody else has another proposal in the meantime that they want to do, feel free. But yeah, we're definitely planning on doing it this cycle, but I don't have a definitive timeline at the moment.
Okay, sounds good. I'll leave it up to you to fill the Google Doc out with more details, and a link maybe to the Google Doc when you're ready.
You had a question, Chad?
Oh, I actually had one more thing to add to the test proposal. I've noticed that there is some work going on in the community regarding end-to-end tests, and I would just love to talk to anybody who has thought about or has been working on end-to-ends for their particular provider. Because I think this is going to encompass a lot of like disparate work, pulling it all together.
Just sync with me. Or me and Andrew can.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on the proposals before we move on? All right. Over to Maciej about cluster autoscaler.
Sure. I also see Michael has a point about cluster autoscaler below. So we should probably handle them together. I think it's like 2 positions down. So we had and by the way, I'm one of the maintainers of cluster autoscaler. We had a discussion on the SIG autoscaling meeting this week, and the conclusion was that we're going to merge the pull request with the implementation that Michael has linked in the doc. So that's one thing. There is just like some minor rebasing stuff, and I think there is a discussion on V1 Alpha 1 versus V1 Alpha 2. From SIG autoscaling point of view, we don't really have enough context or strong preference, so whichever one you decide, I think we're happy to go with. And another point I'd like to raise here is we actually spent like quite significant amount of time in cluster autoscaler community thinking about like longer term issues of cluster autoscaler and cluster API integration, because the current approach has some problems that like it's in some ways less safe than existing implementations, and especially around upgrades. So there is the case where basically the cluster API controllers and cluster autoscaler may be modifying the cluster at the same time, leading to many races, especially if a surge upgrade is used. So I wrote down a doc with a list of issues that we are currently aware of, and it's linked here. And basically, I'd like this doc. There is no solution there, just a list of problems, and I'd like this doc to be a sort of starting point for a discussion on how we can address those issues. One thing I'd like to finally mention at the end is I don't think we should necessarily just say, because those are very much day 2 issues, but I don't think we should just say we'll add it later, because I think the sort of reason where the issues are coming from is a difference in the models used by cluster API and cluster autoscaler. And it may be good to look into this while cluster API is in alpha, because I think some changes to cluster API may also be necessary in order to address those issues. So I think that's pretty much it from my side.
All right, so I definitely encourage anybody who is interested in integration between the autoscaler and cluster API to take a look at that document and provide some feedback. With that said, let's go ahead and hand it over to Michael for his comments around cluster autoscaler.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I pretty much was in the same meeting, and so what was already said is a lot of what I was going to say. So it's good to see that cluster autoscaler folks are happy to move forward with something to include cluster API. As you know, we're doing this downstream, and we've been eager to get this upstream, both there and in cluster API. And we've had some discussions with other consumers in the cluster API world out in the wild, and they're consuming that patch set. And so basically I brought it up on this meeting a few times, cluster autoscaler integration. And so we were given like a couple to-do items, basically getting some documentation somewhere about how we intend to consume it with cluster API, have that documentation live somewhere in our part, the caveats, things that aren't working, and then come up with like a road plan to maybe address some of those issues like was mentioned. So I just wanted to bring that up here and get everybody's thoughts.
I think, sorry, I should have raised my hand.
Go ahead, Tim.
I think we should probably, this might be like one of those criteria that we should address as a beta blocker, right? So we might want to at least open up a tracking issue for the time being in the main repository, and then maybe have a flag or a label or something to list this as potential beta blocker.
If you do decide to open any issues, can you please add like tag SIG autoscaling? Because I think from our side we'd be very interested in this discussion.
Will do.
Vince?
Yeah, I was gonna say like the same, like let's rally up in an issue. Also, one note about V1 Alpha 2, I think there were some fields in V1 Alpha 1 about cluster autoscaler in, I believe, machine class, which were then dropped in V1 Alpha 2. So the integration with V1 Alpha 2 might not be as easy. That said, like V1 Alpha 1 is almost like in the back burner, like in terms of like feature and bug fixes. So it might be worth it, yeah, like to discuss an issue and look to the next release, the next cycle, on how to integrate, and we can work together on a solution.
Yeah, with the machine pool proposal, I probably want to sync with the autoscaling folks to talk about that. So I'll take a look at the public doc too.
Michael?
Yeah, I think the cluster autoscaler folks had said they're pretty happy with the shape the PR is in now. I think that's a good starting point. So I'd be for merging sooner than later. And also I mentioned in the doc here, I believe downstream we've got patch sets that we're carrying locally that we're using the skill sub-resource. I have to talk to my colleague Andrew McDermott more about that particularly. He's more of the cluster autoscaler person than I am. But so I don't think it's really super tightly coupled to any one API version at this point. But that patch has been out for a while. And so we're hoping to get some movement on that so we can then community start iterating on it rather than one big patch that we have to get perfect. And so if we merge it sooner than later, then everybody can contribute, I think.
Vince?
And just to clarify, this is a PR in the cluster autoscaler repo, right? Like there's no PR lined up for cluster API, is that correct?
Yeah, this is in reference to the cluster autoscaler PR that I linked in the section that I included, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions, comments, or concerns related to autoscaler integration? Justin?
Yes, I was just wondering about the V1 Alpha 1, V1 Alpha 2 thing. Like, to what extent do we think we're going to keep changing? Like, I feel like V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2 is a fairly bigger API change. Do we feel, I know that we're not compelled down by this in any way because it's an alpha, but do we feel like there are going to be a lot more API changes from, like, on the road to V1, or do we feel like the shape is more or less as we like it? Because I feel like it will influence the like the dynamic client versus alternatives in this autoscaler PR.
So in general, I think it's tough to absolutely say. However, I think that I don't foresee any large changes on the machine deployment or the machine set side at this point. But in the larger grand scheme of things, I'm not sure we can make confident statements around that. And I see Vince has his hand up.
Yeah, I would agree. While the foundations are good and we want to build upon them, it's really hard to say, I guess. The problem with V1 Alpha 1 and target V1 Alpha 1 is like, it's completely fair to target with this PR V1 Alpha 1. And you mentioned the client generated, which we actually don't have in V1 Alpha 2, and we're not planning to add it back going forward. So this will be a pretty big change. We're kind of steering towards using controller runtime client, for example. And yeah, so there will be larger changes to bring this to V1 Alpha 2, but going forward, like, who knows, I guess.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, Vince, you have making the cluster required.
Yes. So a while ago, I think there's an issue open to making the cluster reference required. I'm gonna find it. But like, long story short, is like this impacts machine set of machine deployments. Today, these objects are linked to the cluster via label, and then the label kind of sets the owner reference back to the cluster. This has proven, like in the course of like multiple months after the release of V1 Alpha 2, to confuse a lot of folks in terms of like UX, but also like in terms of debugging. For example, when you create a machine deployment, the label has to be specified 3 times in the machine deployment own labels, in the selector fields, and in the template. Moreover, the machine deployment cannot actually function without a kubeconfig secret. The kubeconfig secret, it also needs a cluster name, which means you have to have a cluster reference. And some folks a few months ago came in saying like, my machine deployment is not actually scaling up and everything is unavailable. And that was because they were not using the cluster object. They were just using the machines, which leads to conclusion. So the general feeling around this, like to make everything in cluster that's like kind of opinionated, like the infrastructure reference, optional. So you don't have to like kind of create the AWS cluster or like whatever infrastructure provider cluster type if you don't want to. But at the same time, make sure that like the core types are kind of like a little bit more cohesive and like they actually function as we say that they function, because there are assumptions in the code today they make effectively the cluster reference required, but it's not written anywhere. So if there are no pushback or like feedback, I would like to make a little more detail in the linked issue here, and make sure that like we have a well spec'd out plan going forward, and like the changes that like will come up for the next cycle.
Andy?
Thanks. I wanted to emphasize a point that is in the issue that Vince has up on the screen now, which is that the cluster object does not really have to have anything in it, given that the infrastructure reference is optional. So it's really a very lightweight rallying point to associate machines, machine sets, and machine deployments, that they all point to a singular thing that logically represents a cluster. So hopefully this won't be super contentious. It means you have to create an extra object, even if your environment doesn't really need it, but it does greatly simplify a lot of the code that we've been working with.
Questions, comments, concerns, feedback?
Do we want to do a lazy consensus on this?
I'm fine with it. This has been open for months now. I would really like to start drawing a plan of action. I can add it in the issue and present it to the next week meeting.
Justin?
Well, does anyone have any? Are there any objections? I guess. Right. I don't think we know. We haven't heard any arguments against, really, that I've heard.
All right. I don't see anything. So what I would suggest is if we are looking for lazy consensus, we probably should also follow up with a item on the mailing list as well, just in case, and then also call out that we're going to do consensus on the GitHub issue in case there are folks that are trying to access from China that don't necessarily have the Google groups, and then we can set the timeout. All right. There's nothing there. Next item is Andy with checking in on the Cordon and Drain.
Thanks. So this is for Michael. Just wanted to see if you and Vince were able to figure out what we need to do to get the compilation issues resolved.
Yeah, we discussed it like a week and a half ago. We just need to patch that patch locally to get it to pass linters, and I'm committed to doing that. I did not find the time I expected to. I'm hopefully going to do that today, like right after this call. I'm sitting down to do it, so that's the plan.
Thanks. If you need one of us to just do the last little bit to get it to the finish line, let us know.
So in this case, this is basically importing the upstream code in as a temporary workaround until we can actually vendor it.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't support the version of something that we're on, and it's on something different, but the code is one-to-one copy. It just fails linters.
If that's the case, should we just exclude those files from the linting rather than trying to refactor to just make linters happy?
That would 100% be my preference, because that would allow us to, in the future, just copy over things if they change and not have to worry about doing anything to them.
I'm on board with that.
Yeah, I just don't see a point in refactoring to make linters happy when it's a temporary fix.
Yeah, and it seems to pass their linters, or maybe they're not running linters in their own repository, so it's kind of one of those things. I'm not really sure how to go about excluding linters, so maybe that should be a follow-on patch to this one.
I can help you with that. Should be pretty straightforward.
Okay, yeah, just catch me in Slack.
Thanks, everybody.
Any other questions or comments there? All right. Next up is Stephen, CapZ alpha release.
Hey everyone. So there has been a lot of hard work across Microsoft and VMware since we met face to face. Was it 2 weeks ago? So we just I think we've gotten to the point where we can release. So we just cut a alpha release for v3.0 of CapZ, which is the v1 alpha 2 stuff. I'm going to use that alpha release as a starting point to clean up docs and the release process and make sure that everything is vetted properly. We're just waiting for an image to be promoted, but that is available. When the docs are available, I'll send something out wide for people to actually kick the tires on it. Super excited, and I'm happy that everyone worked together so hard on it. So congrats. Big shout out to Vince and Cecile for carrying a good portion of it.
Any questions or comments about the new CapZ v1 alpha 2 release? All right. Next up is Matt with a question about a pull request for the KubeADM Bootstrap provider.
Firstly, thank you for the reviews on the PR. I'm just here representing the PR for Seth. I just want to make sure that there's any other changes needed other than the var switch to a constant. And I see Chuck's comment now on the Google Doc, but I believe Seth should have time this morning to fix it. If not, I can push a commit to fix that. But
yeah, just that and squashing the commits. Otherwise, it looks fine. I think
cool.
the rest of the discussion was like tangential.
Okay, yeah, and we've been running the patch version for about a week now. So
sweet.
All right, that is all. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, awesome. That brings us to the end of the scheduled agenda outside of the backlog grooming. Is there anything anybody wanted to bring up before we jump into the issues? No? All right. Andy, are you good?
Yeah.
Running the backlog? All right.
Yeah, so Vince or whoever's sharing, please stop, and I'll go ahead and flip over. Okay. Alrighty, so we have 3 issues for Cluster API with no milestone and 2 for the KubeADM Bootstrapper. The first one is, could we commit the vendored code into a vendor folder in the Cluster API repository, which we used to do and stopped doing with the move to V1 Alpha 2? I like not having the vendored code committed, but I can certainly understand why there's this request. So I would say if you have thoughts, definitely add them in the comments, or we could just decide what we want to do right now. But I'm leaning towards not doing it unless it's like really such an impediment that it is harming people from being able to do what they need to do.
Vince?
Yeah, given that I removed the vendor folder, I'm also like inclined to keep it removed. It really simplifies people forgetting to like update vendor or like having a whole pipeline that checks if the vendor folder is in sync. The issue seems like more of a user problem around like not having a working proxy, which will solve this issue. So I'm inclined to push back here.
Well, it can be more than that, though. There's a bunch of GitHub is down scenarios. There's also a bunch of air-gapped environment scenarios where the repository being self-contained is a useful feature. And that's kind of the reason why most of the repositories in kproper do have the vendor folder. It's just so that if you get a fork of the repository, it's a self-contained thing.
It's only important in air-gapped scenarios where the build environment also has to be an air gap, though. So that's certainly far from all air-gapped environments, would be my guess.
I wouldn't presuppose that because we do that. Other people do that too. So there's a lot of constraints.
Sorry.
I just want to say, I think this particular person may be behind a country firewall, so that might be the scenario here in terms of not being able to have a working proxy. So that does feel like a special case that we should be aware of. I was wondering whether we can have the vendor in a different branch or something. I might play with that.
So I'm also kind of in the same boat as Justin there, because the issue here is this is one of our Chinese contributors, so they may be chasing working Go proxies that are accessible through the Chinese firewall. And I don't necessarily know that asking users to manage their own Go proxy might be a little much to ask to contribute. So since we are trying to be inclusive of the community, we may want to consider that above, just standard developer experience. David?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that another reason is some companies need legal review for code that they import. And if you have a vendor directory, it means that you could have that legal review with a single PR. Whereas if you have to import 24 dependencies, it looks much different and it feels much different going through the review process. So.
All right, so Justin has volunteered to look into this, and that is a very valid point, David, because we have similar restrictions or requirements, so we'll check into that on our end too. From a milestone perspective, I think at this point, I'm inclined to put it in next while Justin does some research, and then when we have some more information, we can either put it in the appropriate milestone because we're going to do it, or we'll close it, whatever the resolution is. All right. Next up is something that Vince opened on an SDK. Vince, you want to chat about this briefly?
Yeah, in terms of milestone, this can go to next. It doesn't have to be in this cycle. If someone has to kind of time to look into how do we want to consume Cluster API from a development perspective, we talked about having all the code that should be consumed somewhere else. I don't want to put it in another repo, but an SDK directory seem like the most straightforward solution that will kind of help for communicating breaking changes to infrastructure providers, bootstrap providers, and guarantee some API compatibility. That's all.
Okay, thanks. I did put this in next, and I did long-term on the priority.
Thanks.
And last, Ashish?
Yeah, so I had a question on the KEPs that folks have been working on. Will all the KEPs result in issues being created in the repo for people to pick and work on? If I'm asking because I might not be able to participate in the discussions and but I would love to contribute in whatever way I can. So I wanted to know if issues will be created for all the KEPs.
Yeah, we will make every effort possible to break down the work items into as many individual issues as we can so that we can split up the tasks and have anybody who wants to be involved work on them.
Okay, thank you.
All right, this last one is actively being worked on with an open PR. So, and it's a docs thing. So I'm just going to stick it in the 0 to X because it is coming soon. And then we have, Warren, you've got your hand up. Sorry, I didn't see that.
So I was actually going to create another issue right before the meeting started regarding the documentation as well for cluster CTL. I noticed that there's documentation for creating clusters, but kind of missing documentation for cluster CTL delete. I was wondering what's the community's take on actually adding more documentation for a tool that is kind of on the path for deprecation, but then there's also a conversation of converting cluster CTL to cluster ADM. I just kind of want to understand the viability of cluster CTL in the future and contributing more work towards that tool. Thank you.
Tim?
Too soon. I know Fabrizio is currently working on this. You can assign it to me for us to at least to triage for this cycle. But I don't think we are going to try to get something in place, but what we call it is TBD. But Fabrizio is doing a lot of the work with a lot of feedback from other folks, and we'll probably have a demo and some other things in the future once it's a little more solid. So more a demo plus a KEP. So that might be a little bit more on the asynchronous side from all the other KEPs that are ongoing right now.
So from my perspective, to answer Warren's question, I think that because we don't have a replacement for ClusterCuddle, that if somebody wants to write some documentation on things like ClusterCuddle delete, that it's worth it, even though we know that the tool will be updated in the future. But I think more documentation now is better than less, personally. Okay, 2 issues here in the CubeADM Bootstrapper. We have one saying that the etcd data directory shouldn't be required. And Chuck, I know you and I had gone a little bit back and forth on this. This was just, we needed to modify some of the fields in our copy of the CubeADM types, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then add the default into the code.
I think in terms of priority, probably somewhere between soon and long term.
I would just err on the side of soon.
And do you think we should try and get this in as part of what
Yes.
we've got out there for V1 Alpha 2? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Works for me. Tim?
We chatted about this for changes for V1 Beta 3 today for CubeADM, and we'll make these changes in the CubeADM types for the next cycle as well.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you. And then we have an issue from DIMS, add support for overriding binaries in the Bootstrap provider to avoid Ansible usage.
Yeah, Jason and I went back and forth on this. I think it's actually possible today, but maybe it's not necessarily easy.
I see, looks like DIMS had to go. I'm tempted to volunteer him to see if he can figure out how to do it.
Well, the thing is, we have all the pieces in place to do this, right? We have a way to run scripts before CubeADM, which can go fetch binaries from somewhere and put them as you want them to be. So, like, I see all the pieces there. I don't know if the request here is for a change to the API to make this easy or what.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is how easy do we actually want to make this, considering this is also something specifically meant for testing environments.
Yep.
So we may want to potentially even choose another route and just have a helper for generating the more verbose config that's possible today. So you can also assign me to this as well, Andy, and I'll help with
okay,
verifying that we can actually do this today, and then figure out what we want to do longer term.
All right, thank you, Jason and Chuck. I believe that ends all of the issues with no milestones. So back to you, Jason.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns, or topics that anybody wants to bring up before we close for the day? No. If not, all right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks all.